January 3rd, 2026, 2 o'clock in the morning. For the history books, this was supposed to be the moment America reminded the world who was in charge. Over 150 aircraft thundered across the Caribbean. Precision strikes rocked Caracas. And in less than 30 minutes, Delta Force operators had extracted a high-value target from one of the most heavily fortified compounds in the Western Hemisphere. In Washington, the champagne corks were popping. The president called it a stunning display of American resolve. The networks ran non-stop coverage of the tactical brilliance, the speed, the overwhelming power. But they missed the real story. While Washington was celebrating a tactical victory, something else was happening on the other side of the world. In Beijing, there were no emergency meetings, no panic, just quiet satisfaction. Because that raid didn't just topple a dictator. It walked right into a trap that had been set 25 years ago. The moment American boots touched Venezuelan soil, the United States didn't win a war. It lost an entire continent. And it signaled the beginning of the end for the most powerful economic weapon in human history, the US dollar. To understand why a successful military raid became a catastrophic strategic defeat, we have to look away from the explosions in Caracas. We have to look at the ghosts that have been haunting this region for a century. You see, in the United States, we tend to view history in 4-year election cycles, but in Latin America, history is measured in scars. And the scar tissue from American intervention is thick. When the news of the 2026 raid broke, the reaction in Mexico City, Brasilia, and Santiago wasn't relief. It was a collective, visceral flashback. According to Harvard University's own data, between 1898 and 1994, the United States intervened to change governments in Latin America 41 times. That is an average of one government overthrow every 28 months for an entire century. Every nation south of the Rio Grande remembers the playbook. They remember 1954 in Guatemala. President Jacobo Arbenz wasn't a communist radical. He was a democratically elected leader who tried to give land back to farmers. But that land belonged to the United Fruit Company. So the CIA orchestrated a coup, labeled him a threat, and plunged Guatemala into a 36-year civil war that claimed 200,000 lives. They remember 1973 in Chile, September 11th, a date that means something very different in Santiago. The presidential palace bombing that killed Salvador Allende and installed General Augusto Pinochet. What followed was Operation Condor. This wasn't just a series of isolated coups. It was a multinational terror network, backed by Washington, designed to hunt down dissidents across borders. From Buenos Aires to La Paz, thousands of people, students, union leaders, teachers, were kidnapped, tortured, and thrown out of helicopters into the ocean. In 1992, in a dusty police station in Paraguay, they found the Archives of Terror, hundreds of thousands of documents proving the coordination behind these atrocities. Documents that had American fingerprints all over them. This is the context that Washington ignored in 2026. So, when American forces landed in Venezuela to restore democracy, the region didn't see liberators. They saw the ghosts of 1954. They saw the ghosts of 1973. Brazilian President Lula didn't condemn the raid because he loved the Venezuelan government. He condemned it because he knew that if international law could be broken there, it could be broken anywhere. The raid unified Latin America against the United States in a way that no diplomat could have predicted. But while the US was busy managing the political fallout of its military muscle, it failed to notice the economic quicksand it was standing on. Because Venezuela isn't just a country with a troubled history. It is the sitting on top of the largest strategic trap in the energy world. And to understand that trap, you need to understand one specific number, 33 billion. 303 billion. That is the number of barrels of proven oil reserves sitting beneath Venezuelan soil. According to OPEC data, this makes Venezuela the single largest petroleum repository on the planet. Larger than Saudi Arabia, larger than Iran. Nearly 18% of all the oil on Earth lies within the borders of this one South American nation. But here is the critical detail that the headlines missed. The detail that turns this prize into a logistical nightmare. Venezuelan oil is not like Saudi Arabian oil. It is not the light sweet crude that burst out of the ground in Texas. It is heavy sour crude. It is thick as molasses, packed with sulfur and incredibly difficult to process. And this creates a magnificent irony. The massive refineries along America's Gulf Coast, in Texas and Louisiana, were built 50 years ago specifically to handle this type of sludge. The American industrial machine that produces diesel, jet fuel, and heavy lubricants was literally designed to run on Venezuelan oil. We have the refineries, but we don't have the oil. Venezuela has the oil, but they no longer have the capacity to refine it. By 2025, Venezuela's production had collapsed from 3 million barrels a day to less than 1 million. Their infrastructure is rusting. Their pipes are leaking. Estimates suggest it would require $180 billion in investment over 15 years just to get the oil flowing again. So when American politicians talk about seizing the oil, they are ignoring reality. You cannot just seize it. You have to rebuild an entire industry from the ground up. It is a project that requires patience, massive capital, and deep relationships. And this is where the United States made its fatal miscalculation. While Washington spent the last 25 years focused on the Middle East, fighting insurgencies in the desert, another player was quietly setting up shop in America's backyard. They understood that you don't need to invade a country to own it. You just need to pay its bills. In 2001, Venezuela became the first Hispanic nation to sign a strategic development partnership with the People's Republic of China. At the time, American policymakers brushed it off. But looking back, that signature was the first shovel of earth dug for the grave of the Monroe Doctrine. Over the next 2 decades, Beijing extended nearly $60 billion in state loans to Venezuela. That is double what they loaned to any other Latin American nation. But these weren't just cash handouts, they were strategic purchase orders. Most of these loans were structured as oil for financing agreements. China provided the capital, Venezuela paid it back in guaranteed crude shipments. When Western banks slammed the door on Caracas, the China Development Bank kept theirs wide open. They didn't just lend money, they sent engineers, they sent construction crews, they built the railways that transport the equipment, they built the power grids that run the pumps. Companies like Huawei built the telecommunications networks that the Venezuelan military relies on to communicate. By 2025, approximately 80% of Venezuela's crude exports were flowing to Chinese refineries. And unlike the US, China built new specialized facilities capable of processing that heavy, sulfurous Venezuelan oil efficiently. They created the infrastructure. They trained the personnel. They made themselves indispensable. In May 2024, while the Western media was distracted by elections, China and Venezuela signed an investment protection agreement. It established a legal framework to protect Chinese assets in Venezuela, regardless of who is in charge. This was Beijing preparing for exactly the scenario that unfolded on January 3rd. So, when American forces captured the presidential palace, they walked into a country where the operating system was owned by someone else. The hardware might be Venezuelan, but the software is Chinese. And the global reaction to this raid revealed something even more terrifying for Washington. When the bombs fell, the condemnation didn't just come from the usual enemies like Iran or Russia. It came from democracies. It came from trade partners. It came from nations that the US assumed were firmly in its orbit. Because they realized something profound. If the United States is willing to use military force to secure resources in 2026, then holding US dollars isn't a safety net anymore. It's a vulnerability. And that realization triggered the one thing Washington fears more than nuclear war. The trap was sprung. But the real casualty wasn't the Venezuelan military. It was the American dollar. For 50 years, the global financial system has operated on a simple, unspoken agreement. The United States provides security and the world conducts business in dollars. This was the foundation of the Petrodollar. But on January 3rd, 2026, the United States broke the deal. By using direct military force to seize a sovereign nation's resources, Washington sent a terrifying signal to every capital in the global south. Your money is safe in our banks until we decide it isn't. Your borders are respected until we decide they aren't. The reaction was immediate and invisible to the naked eye. It happened on trading floors and in central bank vaults. Imagine you are the finance minister of Saudi Arabia or Brazil or Indonesia. You watch the news. You see American troops in Caracas. You look at your own country's reserves, billions of dollars held in US Treasury bonds. Suddenly, those bonds don't look like savings. They look like handcuffs. And so, the Great Unwinding accelerated. It didn't start in 2026. It had been building for years. According to the World Gold Council, central banks had been buying gold at record paces, over 1,000 tons annually between 2022 and 2024. They were quietly building lifeboats. But after the Venezuela raid, the lifeboats were launched. The BRICS alliance, already controlling 40% of the global population, activated emergency protocols. China and Russia, who had already bypassed the dollar for 90% of their trade, opened their payment systems to the rest of the world. The Bridge project, a digital currency platform designed by China and the UAE to bypass American banks entirely, saw its transaction volume explode overnight. Saudi Arabia, the very kingdom whose 1974 agreement created the petrodollar, began settling oil trades in yuan. The message was clear. You cannot sanction a country that doesn't use your bank. You cannot threaten a nation that doesn't need your currency. China wins this war not by firing missiles, but by offering an alternative. While the US offers democracy delivered by airstrikes, Beijing offers stability delivered by infrastructure contracts. To a world tired of chaos, stability is a powerful drug. So, what is the final balance sheet of the Venezuela operation? Tactically, a masterpiece. The US military proved it can still capture any leader, anywhere, at any time. The refineries will be secured. The oil will eventually flow north, but strategically, it is a catastrophe. The United States wanted to isolate Venezuela. Instead, it isolated itself. It wanted to demonstrate strength. Instead, it demonstrated that it no longer trusts the diplomatic architecture it built 80 years ago. An empire that rules through consensus is powerful. An empire that rules only through fear is brittle. Eventually, fear stops working. Eventually, the cost of occupation becomes too high. Eventually, the world simply moves on. In the end, January 3rd, 2026 will be remembered not as the day America returned to glory, but as the moment the pretense finally collapsed. The day the United States traded its soft power for a few billion barrels of heavy crude. The irony is almost too perfect. We went south to save the petrodollar, and in doing so, we killed it. History is happening right now, and the signs are everywhere if you know where to look. If you want to understand the economic forces that are actually shaping your future beyond the headlines, make sure you are subscribed. I want to hear from you in the comments. Do you think the US dollar can survive a fractured world order? Or are we witnessing the beginning of a multipolar century? Drop your thoughts below. I read every single one. Thanks for watching.